in addition to my MD, a master's in bioinformatics and computational medicine. But I always tell people disparities, and specifically racial disparities, are my passion. Prostate cancer, when Black men present, most of the time it's with later stage disease and with more aggressive disease. It was thought that, it was just this innate biology that if you were of the Black race, that you had this innate biology that made your prostate cancer just that more aggressive, specifically compared to people of white race, white men. So that's majority of the reason why when you go to the doctor, if you're seeing someone about screening for, prostate cancer or something along those lines, where they ask you about your race. Even today, a lot of the literature that's published, it says risk factors for prostate cancer. It'll say family history, it'll say something about obesity, maybe smoking, but then it's always Black race. And, I think one of the things that I'm always very conscientious of and constantly trying to push our field forward is to actually think about this before we start promoting, that being Black just innately means that you're going to form this aggressive prostate cancer. And the reason I say that is because race is a social construct. It was created to separate people. And if we have a social construct, I'm not saying that there aren't small variations that kind of give us our physical traits, but the vast majority of our genomes, our genes, are they identical. And to date, we haven't found anything specific that we can point to and say, aha, that's why Black men form more aggressive prostate cancer. So it's time for us to start really doing the heavy lifting to look underneath the hood, so to speak, to all of the different reasons why, like food insecurity, living in violent neighborhoods, poverty, all of these things that can really, environmental exposures can really impact someone's health, to start looking at those things and why that actually influences the gene expression and the development of cancer and things like that. Over time, your living environment, lived experiences, that could be changes at the genetic level, at the genomic level, that influence how your genes are expressed over time. It's not just poverty, but it does have a big part to do with, the exposures you have throughout life, stressors you have throughout life. So all of these things influence health outcomes. People are talking social determinants of health, financial security, where you live, how where you work, your ability to get to the hospital, have care, like all of these things, food insecurity, they all play a part. It's the zip code neighborhood association rather than the DNA that actually is causing so many of these disparities and outcomes that we see. I haven't thought about whether or not that is actually a form of systemic racism or structural racism. I do think that there should be a shift in the way that we fund research from trying to identify a biological cause for this disparity. And here's the reason I say this. We know that diversity in medicine is lacking. We know that cancer patients, if they're Black race, if they see someone of concordant race, they receive higher quality of care. We know that Black patients don't have the same access to care. They're more likely to be uninsured or underinsured. They're more likely to, not receive the standard of care treatment. And so even if, let's say, gene X was identified and said, this is the reason why Black men are more likely to form prostate cancer. We're funding all of this to find gene X, where the funding should be more so around community engagement and outreach. So that diversity in medicine, we can close that gap. When it comes to lack of representation with clinical trials, we can start to close that gap. A paper that came out and showed that, it looked at all cancer mortality. And it stretched from back to 1950. And what you see is that these racial disparities back then didn't even exist when it comes to cancer mortality. And then around 1955, and I'm not saying this is causal, but this just kind of illuminates the point I'm trying to make. Around 1955, when the National Cancer Institute actually started a cooperative, and we started the first chemotherapies, and then we had clinical trials just kind of come out the wazoo, what you start to see is those racial disparities balloon. And then we never closed the gap. And so to me, it's saying, okay, well, if we have all of these new technologies, new modalities to screen, diagnose, and treat cancers of all types, why are these racial disparities continuing? But you know what gap also we haven't, done anything about? The wealth building gap, educational gaps, like all of these things, poverty gap, like all of these things are still in existence. So even though the technology has got better, and even though our ability to do all of these different things related to cancer has got better, we haven't closed, if anything, we made it worse. I think at times within medicine, we kind of feel like we're separate from the rest of society. And, racism doesn't impact medicine, but to be honest, that's far from the case because we're individuals who make up these institutions. And there's several prestigious institutions around the country, but they're made of individuals. And would be very foolish to think that the individual biases or, deep-seated structural racism don't impact our institutions, because they do. And so if we can't even acknowledge that race is a social construct and that racism is a real thing within the disparities research that we're doing, then how are we going to actually close this gap and solve the problem? They caveated racial disparities is because there are other disparities that we do note, which, like for instance, income disparities within cancer treatment. If you're poor living in a rural area, you might be white, but you're still less likely to be offered a clinical trial or be on a clinical trial than somebody who is more affluent and white. So, even within race, you still see disparities based off of income and, poverty levels. So I think that's probably the reason why we kind of use those racial disparities, because those other disparities still exist. I think that's the most important thing at this point.